Before that time.
That's the physics behind, for example,
Another question
the actual change of mass.
question gets to about
the course of 7 years in which the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholars Chair. Tonight, a conversation with Dr. Fatimah Jackson. She is a professor at the biology department at Howard University. At Focus, how does the study of African genetic variations contribute to our knowledge of human population and human origins?
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is true?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. And here is your host. Welcome to the Scholars Chair, Professor Jackson. It's good that you could be with us. Tell me, what is your PhD in?
So my PhD, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's very nice to be here. My PhD is from Cornell University in biological anthropology. I'm trained in human biology, and I concentrated in parasitology, population genetics, and human biological variation.
And your master's was?
Also from Cornell in biological anthropology.
And your graduate studies also at Cornell?
Oh yeah, all of my degrees are from Cornell.
Yeah, this is great. And you're currently teaching at Howard, correct?
Yes, I'm a professor of biology at Howard, and I direct the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory.
Yes. How long has the lab been around? It's been around for a while.
Oh
now.
yeah, the lab was founded in 1931 by W. Montague Cobb, who was an outstanding anatomist, physical anthropologist, the first African-American biological anthropologist, a physician, professor. He was also very much engaged in community medicine, ran the local chapter of the NAACP, lobbied with U.S. presidents for Social Security reform and so forth. So very outstanding Renaissance man.
In person. And you've been making your own contribution to academics. How long have you been teaching and being a professor? Just
I've been
over the years.
Oh yeah, just a couple of years. I've been teaching for 40 years.
Yes. Oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, we have this topic that I think when people hear that I'm talking about it, they get a little nervous because they can't quite fit in the study of African genetic variations and what that means to our understanding of humanity. So I'm going to ask the question I asked at the top was, how does the study of African genetic variation contribute to our knowledge of human population?
Well, you know, we have to put African and all human variation within an evolutionary context. And when we do that, we realize that Africa really is the homeland of humanity. So the great bulk of human genetic diversity is in Africa and among contemporary Africans. With Africa being the homeland of our species, Homo sapiens, then the migrations of some segments of Africans out of Africa to populate Europe and Asia, the Americas, Australia, and Oceania, those represent migration movements of essentially African peoples who over time became transformed to become Europeans or Asians or Native Americans or Australians. And in that context, you can really see the unity of humanity. And so the importance of African genetic variation is that it still retains much of the variation that is human.
And we call it something specific, don't we? This Homo sapiens sapien, I think it's.
Yeah, Homo sapiens sapiens. We think of ourselves as being wise. It's an aspirational taxonomic category.
I see. So we aspire to that point.
We aspire to be wise.
So what is the phenotype, and what about its variation? How does it make its contribution to human origins?
Well, so the phenotype is what you see, the visible representation of an organism. Behind that phenotype is...
So a person is tall, short, female,
right,
black, white, Asian.
Right, right. That's the phenotype.
I see.
Their metabolic status, their intellectual potential, that's all a part of the phenotype. Behind that is the genotype. That is the genetic blueprint. And the phenotype is really the product of the interaction of the genotype, the blueprint, and the environment, because the environment helps to also shape who we actually are.
Yes. What got you excited about this topic? Because I have seen tape after tape after tape of lectures that you've given on similar topics.
I keep talking about the same thing, huh?
No, hardly not. Hardly not. The data's moving too fast.
Well, you know, for me, I'm passionate about it because it seems so fundamental. It's an area of study that is essential for defining who we are and who we are in relationship to our Creator, who we have the potential to be. To me, it's all encoded right there in studies of both the genome and also the phenotype, and studies of the environment and how it interacts with the genome. And so it's about self-discovery, and which is why I'm so interested in it.
Yes. Yeah, I've just noticed that you mentioned the word creator, and I assume that this is a description of God that is informed by your religion, Islam.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, James Watts, as we've mentioned him before in previous programs, have a real problem with trying to reconcile scientific interests with God. And just briefly, just so that we can just kind of put it on the table, how do you do so? How do you reconcile the two?
Well, if you look at this natural world around us, you can study the natural world and see the patterning of natural variation. Yeah. And then you recognize that, like any artist, will have a particular pattern that will flow through their artworks. I believe I see a pattern in the creation that exists around us. And so at the molecular genetic level, trees and humans and muskrats and cabbages all bear a lot in common. And in fact, that's an essential principle in biology, the commonality of life. Yeah. And so to me, that speaks to a single creation, a single origin, and diversity from initial unity.
Interesting. Interesting. Diversity is also important.
Oh, yes. Oh, diversity is essential. Yes. Without diversity, you move very quickly toward extinction.
That is important.
Yes.
Professor Jackson, tell me, why is Africa an important region to study human genetic diversity?
Well, Africa is one of the places we know the least about genetically, but because it's the oldest area of human habitation, we get more mutations, more ecological diversity within Africa. It's the most tropical of continents. Rates of evolutionary change are accelerated within Africa. And so it's a part of the world that we really need to study more if we're going to understand anything about the rest of the world. And it's a shame that our research has focused more on, as my colleague Chris Singer at the British Museum said we focus more on peripheral areas than on the core area of our species. But that's changing. And I know that the Sanger Institute at Cambridge University is very interested. Our own researchers at NIH are interested in African genetic diversity. And we're actually having a conference at Howard next week on ancient DNA, the extraction of ancient DNA, because we've started to do that at Howard. And this will be the first conference that will also deal at Howard with African genetic diversity, how to capture it, and how to develop an African American genome project.
That's excellent. Why this study? Why is this study important, relevant to the evolution of science, period?
You know, our science very much depends upon having a good reference database. So you have to have something to compare your new findings against. And since we know so little about genetic diversity in Africa, it has not been adequately studied. It's very hard to really scrutinize the genetic variants coming out of Africa because we don't have anything to compare it with. So having that reference database, it's like having a control that you can then compare your experimental results to a control, and then you know if the experiment has worked or not.
Yes, yes.
So,
now, then one of the things that I learned by studying this, getting ready for this program, that Africa is just such a huge calling card because of the regional diversity, the geological diversity. Tell me, why is it important to understand the complex interaction between the genetics and the environment?
That is such an interesting area because the genetics we're finding is very gene expression. That is the proteins that are expressed by the genes to create the phenotype. Those proteins are very malleable. We used to think that one gene only produced one protein, but now we understand that one gene can produce multiple forms of a protein. So what causes that gene to produce protein A at one point and protein A prime at another point? And we can see that the environment that the gene is floating in, the chemical environment that surrounds the gene, is going to have a big influence. And this leads us to this concept of epigenetics. Epi means above, genetics. And these are chemical markers that are derived from the environment that are in a close association to the genome, and they can influence how genes express themselves. So the interesting thing about epigenomics or epigenetics is that these markers can be transmitted from one generation to the next. They don't undergo the kind of Mendelian inheritance that the genome does. They don't change your genome, but they change the expression patterns. And so when we think about how the environment can influence disease susceptibility, for example, a lot of that change is mediated through changes in these chemical markers. We can change the chemical markers, which is why we're all running out eating strawberries and blueberries and trying to eat more antioxidants and exercising and stopping smoking and watching our diets and so forth, so that we can change the chemical environment around our genes to optimize their expression rather than having pathological expressions.
Tell me about this wonderful, it's not a nice part of American history, but the abstraction of Africans out of Africa to force them to live in North America. There is a biological effect of such a very quick and aggressive change of environment. Can you talk about that a little bit? And does it still affect us today? And
oh yes. So this is a very important part of American history, because the transatlantic slave trade, or the trade in enslaved peoples, affected the enslavers as well as the enslaved peoples. But we know that that kind of event can act as a major force of selection on a population. And it can begin to reshape the gene pool of a population. And because it changes the criteria for who will survive and thrive and who will die off, and whose lineages will stop, you know, and whose lineages will continue in the New World. And so the study of the biological consequences of the transatlantic slave trade is something I'm very interested in, because we are not the same people that our ancestors were 4 or 5 generations
Genetically
back.
speaking.
Genetically, we're not the same. We're predominantly of African origin, but we also have picked up genes from Europeans, and we picked up genes from Native Americans. And the proportions vary as you look across the Americas. The different groups of Native Americans vary, and the different groups of Europeans that we interacted with. But most profoundly, we are an amalgamation of African peoples. And that is something new that has never been seen before. And I think, you know, we usually look at the whole enslavement process as a very disastrous and the great, we call it the maafa, you know, a catastrophe. And it was a catastrophe. But out of that catastrophe was also born a people with some very unique biological attributes. And part of our efforts to identify an African American Genome Project is to identify who are we and how do we optimize our current identities. How do we take advantage? How do we recognize our susceptibilities and counter them with environmental influences so that those disease-causing genes don't express themselves? And then how do we also maximize all the blessings that we've received, the good things, the advantages that we have? And so that's where the science and the history all kind of come together.
Interesting idea, a positive way of looking at that historical event.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit, introduce us to Sheikh Anta Diop, because you had some glowing words to say about him.
Oh yes, well, you know, whenever you encounter genius, especially genius that is favorably disposed towards your situation, you want to know more about them. You want to get as much information as you can. So Sheikh Anta Diop was, you know, really a Renaissance man, in that he was an anthropologist and a historian and a political scientist and a physicist. And he combined all of this knowledge together in his interests on the origins of humanity, the unity of humanity, and he was very interested in pre-colonial Africa. That is, what did Africa look like before the imposition of foreign cultures? What was the indigenous African mindset? And we're still trying to recapture that. Why? Because humans have spent the longest period of time in Africa. So to see what developed in Africa is very important, recreating that, reconstructing that.
He goes to the point, of course, stating quite emphatically that the first man is of African origin.
Yes.
And I understand that there are 6 different human types, and I believe he said that all of them were found in Africa.
Yes, the greatest diversity, you talked about the phenotypes, so the greatest phenotypic diversity is in Africa.
Yes.
That you have the tallest people, the shortest people, the people with the widest noses, the people with the thinnest noses. You have all kinds of different coloration patterns, straight hair, curly hair, kinky hair, all kinds of different hair. You know, so Africa truly is I think we fail to appreciate how huge it is. You can fit 5 continental United States within the continent of Africa and still have some space left over.
Right. Right. And
So,
the other thing that he left me with in terms of preparing this show, I had to read some of his material. I found it very interesting that he said that it is important to understand Africa as the origin of humanity because having a single origin means that the potential for intellectual evolution and development is the same for everyone.
Yes.
And I found that very stimulating, and it takes a lot of excuses away,
Yes.
and a lot of arrogance as well. You know?
Oh yes, I tell my students that the distribution of intelligence as well as stupidity is equally distributed in all human groups.
Well said. Well said. Tell me, why is it that we haven't have enough documentation about Africa and enough studies on genetic studies from it?
I think that there are several reasons. Most of them have to do with political and economic issues. Of course, history comes in as well. There's been a lot of bias against Africa, a lot of ignorance about Africa. But that is changing, and you really are seeing a resurgence of scientific interest in Africa. And the transformations are occurring not only in Africa, but also in Europe and in the Americas.
Yes.
There's a recognition that, no, Africa has a great deal to offer, and African scientists have a great deal to offer.
Absolutely. I like the idea that we all are Africans. I like the bumper sticker, we all are Africans.
Yes.
What is the relevance and, again, the importance of studying this diversity for demographic history and modern human origins and the complex of mapping diseases? You know, there are a lot of geneticists that talk about how important it is to understand DNA so that you can start to understand how to challenge some of the diseases that make human beings ill and sick and so forth.
You know, for me, Africa and studies of genetic variation in African peoples has made me develop I think, a more sophisticated view of genetics. I've realized that there's no such thing as a bad gene or a good gene. It all depends on the environmental context within which that gene is expressed. So we always say that there's no free lunch in evolution, meaning that there's always going to be a cost to pay. So you're exposed to malaria, and over generations, and over time, and with a great deal of good fortune, sickle cell develops. And it provides some measure, not a complete protection, but some measure of protection. But then you're taken out of that environment, and there's no malaria, but you're still suffering now from sickle cell disease.
Yes.
So was sickle cell good or bad? Well, it depends on the environment. So we're learning some of the more advanced genetics principles by looking at these complex populations in Africa and their descendants in the Americas and elsewhere.
And you can study their DNA and their relationship to the diseases in order to find cures.
Yes. So, for example, there is a molecular genetic variant that seems to predispose, especially African Americans, to a type of disease that's seen in kidney patients. It's called FSGS, follicular segmental glomerular sclerosis, and it just causes scarring on the kidney cells.
I see.
But that same genetic mutation seems to have protected against sleeping sickness in Africa, in Central Africa. So here was something that was beneficial in an African context, but becomes a liability in an American context, especially with an American context with high levels of stress, high salt intakes, and other bad health habits that then predispose to end-stage renal disease and then this scarring of the kidney cells.
That's fascinating. I can see how you can wake up every day and get excited about this.
Yes.
You know, tell me a little bit about Darwin's thing, the natural selection, the general principle of it.
Well, you know, Darwin's idea was, not everybody's surviving. The population's increasing, but there's only so much food. Somebody's got to go. That's natural selection. The selection is selecting against certain phenotypes, and the extent to which those phenotypes have a genetic background, then those genes are being selected against. Then over time, the genetic constitution of the population is transformed because the survivors win and get to reproduce, and those who are less fit, you know, who've been selected against, they don't survive, they don't reproduce, and their genes don't show up in the next generation.
With all the new data that's coming out concerning DNA and genetics, does Darwin's theory still hold, or are we making minor alterations or major alterations?
We're making minor alterations. We're kind of in the neo-Darwinian phase. but you know, his basic principles are sound. But I want to tell you something about Darwin, if I may.
Yes, please.
So I used to wonder, how did Darwin come up with these ideas? You know, how did a young man, first of all, how did he get, after failing out of medical school, out of clerical school, out of divinity school, then he failed out of medical school because whenever they do autopsies, he'd go and throw up. And so that wasn't going to work. No, so I'm sure his father was saying, what am I going to do with this boy? How did he get on the Beagle, the ship, the Beagle, which was an explorer ship, but it was a small ship, not that big, and he didn't have any skills, I didn't think. Come to find out, he had learned taxonomy from a former enslaved person in Guyana. This person, John Edmonstone, had freed himself by doing taxidermy. He taught his father-in-law, had taught the slave owner's father-in-law, had taught Edmonstone taxidermy. He used his skills to gain his freedom, went to London, was a neighbor of Darwin, taught Darwin not only about how to do taxidermy, which ended up being Darwin's task on the Beagle, but also talked to Darwin about the tropical rainforest, because Darwin had never seen that. So, you know, when we credit Darwin with natural selection, theory of natural selection, evolution by means of natural selection, we have to also note the influences on Darwin. And this African-American man from Guyana, this Afro-Guyanese man, had a big influence.
A big influence.
Yeah. So we're partially responsible.
Exactly. Exactly. We're write the history as we see fit.
Yes.
The tremendous linguistic diversity in Africa is relevant to our study of genetics. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so genetics and language are not identical, but they follow some similar patterns. And what we're seeing with language is that the greatest linguistic complexity is in Africa. And then as you move out of Africa, the languages become less complex. Okay, they're not. It's not about inferiority or superiority. It's just internal complexity, and so that some of the linguists have done studies of this and been surprised. But it follows that where a species first began to speak, you'd find the greatest complexity, and then as they move away from that home base, they have fewer words. Less complexity in their language.
How interesting. We had to invite you back, Professor Jackson. Thanks for being with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We're gonna explore this topic in depth. Tonight has been a discussion with educator Dr. Fatimah Jackson from Howard University. We have been talking about African genetic variations. For more Scholars Chair programs, you can go on Read One Communications YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.
Amazing.